Tonight's topic is kind of weird because last time we were together, or last time I did a presentation, it was like how to get the most out of Lent, right? And now I'm already talking about Easter Sunday, kind of like I'm skipping everything in the middle. But it's always good to begin with the end in mind. So I would like to take tonight to focus on where we're going with Lent and what all of our Lenten work is going towards. And of course, it leads to Easter, it leads to resurrection. Tonight is our cohort A and B in-person meeting. Our next meeting next week will be all online for everybody. So look forward to that. And then the cycle just kind of starts over. So that's the schedule of how things work. We are moving through, finishing up our February topics, which were all focused on the kind of the crowning moments of Jesus's life. That being his passion and his death on the cross, but then all that leading to the resurrection. Next month, we'll kind of focus on the beginnings of the church and the ascension and Pentecost and those sorts of things. But tonight, all about the resurrection as the central mystery and claim of the Christian faith. For one, can it be proven? What evidence would you use to support or to back up the resurrection? And then why does that matter? What does resurrection have to do not just with the future hope, but our lives right now? So that's going to be the topic of my presentation for you tonight. I want to begin with some context, kind of throwing back to the last couple weeks, just to have in mind. We talked a lot about the cross and what it means to carry one's cross, perhaps even in the context of Lent. But I want to note specifically that the cross, the crucifixion, this event that Jesus experienced at the end of his life, it's loaded with all kinds of meanings in the scripture. One of those meanings, one thing that I think is especially important for the story of the resurrection, is just what crucifixion, what the cross meant. I would argue, I would start from this position, that the cross by itself, thinking not the crucified Jesus, but just the act of crucifixion, stands for and kind of embodies almost all of the things that oppose God's good order of the world. Like suffering in general, the cross by itself isn't necessarily a good thing. Christ comes along and transforms that, but by itself, it's painful and it's brutal. If you look at the historical context for the crucifixion that precedes the resurrection event, of course, crucifixion was historically something that it came out of Assyria or Babylon, most likely, in the Middle East. But the Romans took it, and the Romans really perfected it. It was not by any means a glorious way to die. In fact, it was the Romans' preferred technique for dispatching movements, ideas, individuals that you never wanted to see again. It was the way to break the back of a movement. And just to iterate that this is not an unusual occurrence in Jesus's time, thousands of people were crucified in the first century in Judea, just in Jesus's own area. So this was it was a common occurrence, and the Romans used it, like I said, to squash movements. There was this fellow I learned a little bit about in the first century, just after Jesus had been around, a Jewish fellow by the name of Bar Kokhba, I believe his name was. A lot of people were thinking he was going to be the Messiah. He was gathering quite a movement. He even had coins minted with his image on it. But the Romans took him and had him crucified. And now we don't hardly know that name anymore, right? No one hears about this dude anymore because crucifixion was bad business. There was no glory in it. This is how you scatter a movement. And in this way, you can almost look at the cross in scripture and beyond that as this type, this symbol of utter God-forsakenness and darkness. It's like the furthest place from glory, the furthest place from goodness that there can be. But the resurrection, then, in that context, is kind of like the ultimate surprise, right? Why on earth would people go around after crucifixion proclaiming, as Paul says, I proclaim only Christ and Christ crucified? What redeeming value, what good can have in that? Precisely because after his crucifixion, Jesus shows up in a room full of his disciples and says, showing him his hands and his side, he says, peace be with you. peace after such a violent and harsh and terrible end. We killed God, but he comes back proclaiming peace to us. And now the disciples of Jesus' time they're familiar with the idea of ghosts. People commonly believed in ghosts in those days, just as people believe in ghosts today. And so naturally they were skeptical perhaps at first, but to that Jesus shows them his wounds, right? He says, these are put your hands in the nail marks, put your hand in my side, and see that I am not a ghost. He even eats right in front of them, thus kind of shattering their expectations. This is something crazy, this is something new, and it has massive ramifications. Because if a crucified man can come back to life, then I would argue that these following things come from it. It would mean, firstly, that God has asserted his love and his power over anything that could stand in the way of him. It's an assertion of God's supremacy, that his love will have the final word, if we should allow it to, in our own hearts. It also means that at like a societal level or anything like that, injustice will not have the final word. Injustice and chaos and darkness will not have the final word. Jesus was an innocent man put to death on the cross. That's a horrible injustice, but God says that injustice will not stand because God himself will come and overturn it. Through the resurrection, he has overturned that injustice. And lastly, I point out the God-forsakenness thing earlier because it shows, to me anyways, that God is going to take all the steps he possibly can to get to any of us in our darkest, deepest moment. God has made a way for us. God has come even into our darkest places to breathe resurrection, to bring new light, to bring new life into that. Ultimately, resurrection, as I conceive it, as I've come to know it in my own life, is the proof that evil, pain, suffering, all those things that we may endure will never have the final word. And the final word is instead Christ standing there, shalom, peace. There is peace to be had. And with that in mind, then, I think we can maybe understand a little bit more just the boldness of our early Christian ancestors, our forefathers and foremothers in faith, because while they were being persecuted, while they were being tortured, while they were being thrown to lions and all that stuff, they had one message that they kept proclaiming, and they felt it was worth dying for, and they went to the ends of the earth to proclaim it. And that is that, Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. He is risen, present tense. He is not dead. He is still going. He's still alive. So you might have killed him, but God has vindicated him. God has raised up what is good, and darkness cannot prevail against it. You killed him, God raised him, which I think is a very powerful message, and I want to take more time to unpack that. But before we do, I want to go to a brief Pear Deck reflection question. Those early Christians, that's what they came proclaiming, Jesus Christ and him crucified, and they brought a message of hope with them as they passed on the faith. So I want you to consider right now, for a moment, who were the people who brought you the faith? Who were the witnesses that shared their hope, their joy, their love with you? So I just want to take maybe 2 minutes here. Go ahead and write some, responses in Pear Deck, and I'll show them around as well. Who have been witnesses of faith to you in your life? Family, parents, wives. I agree with that statement. My wife is very good at showing me what the faith can be about in very practical matters. Prayer from my mom. That's a testament to St. Monica over there, right? Have you ever heard the story of St. Monica, the one who prayed for her son, St. Augustine, who in his youth was very confused, very all over the place, and his mom sat fervent in prayer. And eventually he became a doctor of the church. Okay, yeah. Family especially has a very important role to play in this, right? If some of those early Christian apostles, right, the people they talked to, they didn't necessarily go to the nobles and lords, but when they would talk to families, they'd talk with the parents, and then as the When the parents converted, of course, they brought all their kids with them, and then whole Christian households, everybody in the household would come into the faith together. So never underestimate the power of witness as a parent to your kids, because it can have powerful effects in their life, and it can resound for long periods of long time down the generations. So returning back to the central event of it, the thing that's being proclaimed, the resurrection for all of those witnesses, for all those apostles, becomes a centerpiece of their life. The resurrection of Christ becomes a kind of a key event around which their lives remember that around which their lives revolve. They are going out to the ends of the earth to proclaim this, yes, but they also testify through their lives, through their writings, to the way that just this fact of resurrection changed their own hearts, changed the way they look at the world, and what hope it gave them, and what strength it gave them in the face of great adversity. So what I want to take this remaining bit of time to do is more of a reflection than it is a teaching. This gospel is powerful. Christ said to go forth and to proclaim this to the ends of the earth, baptizing, yes, but he also means that to be received in each of our hearts and to sit there and be planted like a seed that grows into a great fruit-bearing tree, perhaps, to run with the metaphor. It's supposed to be something that we can, it can, for another metaphor, it's like a well that you dig and it fills up with water, and you have that in moments of trial and desperation. All of this comes from the gospel of resurrection. You killed him, God raised him. How can this be good news in the many different situations of our lives? Just want to present some examples and some ideas here of how this is powerful in my life. So first of all, I read that statement, you killed him, God raised him, literally and kind of looking outward, right? In my life, I can take that statement and proclaim it against all the evil powers, all the bad things in the world that I see that are trying to mess things up. I say to all the unjust powers of the world, you killed him, but God raised him. So that gives me strength and peace and hope, so that when I see like tyranny, evil, bad governments, things are messed up out there, and when I see good creation being destroyed and I don't feel like there's anything I can do about it, and when I see other Christians, other people of goodwill who are put down and slandered or subjected to injustice, not because they deserve it, but because they are just for some factor out of their control. Whenever I see that, I see the world out there killing him, right? But in the midst of all of that, there is resurrection, there is hope. I can also read that statement, you killed him, God raised him, in a very personal way, right? You, me, that's me. I as a person, I have some fault in that because it's been my sin and my pain that led to his pain and his suffering and his death. I can look at this as against the evils that I myself have committed, whether those be the minor kind of evils, the things that have lodged in there, the thorns in my life, like addictions, bad habits, little bits of cynicism, especially I find these days that lodge in my heart, or little pieces of pride and arrogance that would have me not get along with others just because I don't want to, right? Even those things are constricting around my heart and just pushing on me and hurting me even when I don't want to admit it. Or when there's like an active moment of choosing what's not good, choosing evil over good, choosing to act against my own good or what God has told me is good, and thereby extinguishing or dampening that good light, that good grace that God has given to me. Even when I do all of those things and it hurts me and wounds me unto death, even if I feel like I'm dying under the weight of my own sin and failure, good news, there is resurrection for that too. Which brings us lastly to the really Lenten suffering kinds of things here. It's not just that you killed him, but it's that now we have the chance, especially as Catholic Christians during the season of Lent, we have the chance to die with him. We tend to think of Lent, of course, as a season where we take on little bits of additional pain, suffering to wake us up to our own human condition, to the condition of the world around us, to get rid of the anesthetic that we run around with, blocking out all the stuff in the world. But when we do come into that, when we do experience suffering for the sake of Christ, when we take up our own cross and walk in the world, whether that's just setting aside one good thing in pursuit of a higher good, I struggle with that one. Setting aside coffee for the morning for the sake of practicing discipline. When relationships as well falter or are strained because of choosing to follow Christ. And that can happen. I can attest to that. That happens in my own family, just between people who are still practicing Christian and who aren't. And that's struggle. That's a struggle. When we struggle with that for the sake of Christ, and when we feel utterly alone or in a desert of faith, where we don't feel any consolation, where we don't feel any joy, when it feels like things inside of us are dying and our faith does not seem to give us the full answer to it, there's good news, because there is resurrection to come, even for those moments, even for that darkest, deepest night of the soul. There will be resurrection too at the end of that. The end story of this, my whole thesis for the night, I guess, is that resurrection is the final word. Lent does not last forever. Lent ends in Easter. And in fact, Easter is a longer season than Lent. This resurrection is the ultimate thing here, and it's what we're striving after in all of the midst of all the things that we're struggling through in this world. I want to stress that whatever dies in Christ can come to life again. That means that all those petty desires, or maybe whatever the lesser goods that we've given up for Christ, something new, something greater can rise up in its place within us. I think of the example of C.S. Lewis in his book The Divorce. He talks about a man who has his lust personified as a lizard on his shoulder. And at some point, an angel comes along and says, "Will you let me kill it?" The man says, "It's really not that much of a bother. It's okay. You can just leave him there. It's fine." But the angel insists, "Will you let me kill it? Will you let me kill it?" And eventually says, "Okay, fine. You can take it and kill it. That's okay." And at first it hurts a lot. Taking this lizard, it crumples up and dies, and the guy crumples up and dies too. But then they both rise again. The lizard turns into a big, majestic stallion for some crazy reason, and the man riding the stallion now rides off into the sunset of heaven. The story to prove that what dies within us, whether that's a lust, whether that's pride, whether that's comfort, whatever it is that dies within us, can be raised to a new and better life. Jesus didn't just come back a normal dude, he came back a resurrected dude. That say that resurrection can occur at every level of our being, and that even now we can experience a foretaste, a little bit of that resurrection. And indeed, in places like this, in a church, we can experience resurrection in multiple different ways, multiple different cases. With all that in mind, then, towards now the end of my ramble on resurrection, why do I believe this? I guess, why do I dare to hope that resurrection is a real and good thing, or that it's here and it has to happen? And I guess my short answer for that is, I mean, Wyatt, Julia, Tim and Teresa, Father Bryce, because he's sitting back there too, but not just because you're sitting back there. These people are the witnesses of resurrection in my life. I've known people who have experienced a lot of pain, who've experienced suffering, but because of Christ at work in their lives, are now living resurrection in maybe a little R way, as we await the big R resurrection at the end of all things. In the end, I think that that's really the best way to prove the resurrection, is seeing people living in the hope, living in the joy, living in the peace of knowing that even if the world, even if everything has killed him, has killed Christ, has killed us, God has raised him. God has raised Christ, and God will raise us, those who have faith in him. So this Lent, I encourage you, as we run towards Easter, as we run this race, and find our way towards Easter, I encourage you to pray with resurrection, to commit whatever in you, maybe you're struggling with this Lent, whatever's dying in you, whatever you feel is losing life, losing vigor, no matter what it is, commit that to God in the same way that Christ was committed to the tomb, right? Let it be buried with the hope that it will be raised again. Pray for resurrection this Easter. I don't know what that looks like for you. I know a little bit, I hope, of what that looks like for me. But we're a community here as well. So using the anonymousness of Pear Deck, I want to ask, how can I pray for you this Lent as we run towards Easter? What healing would you like to experience? Now, again, Pear Deck is completely anonymous. I have no way of tracing any of this back to anybody. And I will also cut the results from the video as well, so that there's no, these are not just floating out there on the internet. But I would like to, in this time, if you have something you would like me to pray for or somebody else to pray for here, go ahead and punch it into Pear Deck. And then I'm going to show it here on the screen in just a minute so that we can pray for each other this Lent, even if we don't know who exactly we're praying for. Thank you, everyone. And I pray for resurrection for you and for healing for you, whatever's on your heart this Lent. Just a glimpse of what lies ahead before we get into some other stuff here for our folks in person. March 3rd, again, is all online. March 10th is our first communion group in person here. A nice blessing we are able to have this Lent is that our clergy will be joining us. Father Bryce will be here tonight, and then Cliff on the 10th to have full-blown Eucharistic adoration and exposition with benediction. So big thanks to our clergy for being able to join us on these particular nights. Our March 24th meeting, which will be right before Holy Week for the same people who are here in person tonight, will be a very, same run as usual. Be sure to check in on Flipgrid, and for those First Communion folks out there, Seesaw. Just for the assignments of the month, make sure you're staying up to date with those, and First Communion folks as well. If you haven't picked up one of the new books, you might want to pick one of those up from the office too. That's the end of our presentation for this week. We'll take a few minutes here to just get reset for adoration and benediction, and then we will roll with that. Folks who are at home, thanks, and see you later. And a couple moments till Father Bryce get things set up.